Greetings Exiles, BullShifter here, back with another PS4 Path of Exile stream. Today's stream, as I had mentioned in the community page, it's going to be a little different today. Hopefully this will be worth the wait for everyone. I know I'm streaming a couple hours later than I normally do. But today, with 3.7 just around the corner for PS4 and console players, I wanted to go through some of my theory crafting that I've done in Path of Building. Path of Building is a very awesome tool that you can get. So essentially, if you just go into Google, go to Path of Building, and if you actually spell it right, that helps also. I mean, you can go to multiple, different websites to get the download for it. It's a completely safe program. It's really awesome. Just download the newest version. It'll automatically download updates just like any other application or program would. And yeah, it's this is Path of Building right here, little icon for it down here, and it essentially allows you to go ahead and create builds in Path of Exile from the ground up. Now, it doesn't require you to have like a gaming level PC to be able to do this with, so you can just have like a crummy old laptop or whatever laying around, and it's mostly text-based, so pretty much any old computer should be able to run it. So I would say as long as you're running at least XP or 7, well, I don't know if it officially supports Windows XP. I'm assuming it would, but I'm just running Windows 7. This is my gaming computer, but I mean, I'm sure this would work on my crummy old laptop just as well. So just something to keep in mind if you ever do want to go ahead and play around with creating your own builds. This is an awesome program to do that in. Now, this is going to be this is technically my theory crafting for the 3.7 patch. This will be my main build for Legion League. I really wanted to go ahead and try out a Cyclone build, because I think Cyclone looks like a ton of fun. It's super cool that they've turned it into a channeling skill. The mana that it costs is relatively low, which allows you to do a lot of really cool things with your potential Cyclone builds. So right now, I do want to preface this by saying that this is essentially like my beta build. So a lot of this will probably change over time. These are just kind of some of the ideas that are going into my head right now of where I'd like to start. A lot of this could potentially change. Odds are, if any of it does change, it'll probably be the skill gems. I feel pretty good about where my passive tree is at, and I've actually left a few points off of my passive tree just to kind of give me some room to play around with. And typically you can pretty much go ahead and respec about 20 to 30 points off your passive tree as well. So you can leave yourself with a little bit of room for error there as well. Hey David, how's it going? Happy Friday. Thank God it's Friday. So I guess I'll start with the skill gems, and with the exception of one skill gem, I actually haven't used any of the new 3.7 skill gems for this build, just because I'd like to try some of them out first. So this could potentially change, and they're also not in Path of Building yet. So Path of Building isn't 100% current with what's going to be in 3.7, so there's only one skill gem that I am 100% positive that I want to use with this build. So the rest of these are actually going to be older skill gems. Like I said, some of these may be swapped out, but obviously with this being a Cyclone Leech build, the first skill that we have here is Cyclone. Cyclone is really awesome in my opinion. Like I said, the fact that they have made the mana cost so much lower, it's going to make it a lot more viable. The fact that it's now a channeling skill as well gives us some more interesting options for the passive tree points that can benefit this skill as well, which I will show you later when we get into the actual passive tree. So this is going to go on your 6th link. Now what I would recommend is you're going to have an opportunity for 2 6 links with this build, because ideally we're going to use a 2-handed weapon, and obviously your chest piece can always be a 6 link as well. Since it's easier to get a 6 link chest piece, since you can just get the tabula rasa, from farming blood aqueducts in Act 9, we're going to go ahead and assume that this is just going to go on a tabula, just because it's so much easier to get. And that's something to keep in mind as well. If you're looking for a 6-link, maybe not even necessarily for this build, farm blood aqueducts in Act 9 to get that divination card that will give you the Rasa, because it's a guaranteed 6-link. It doesn't have any stats, which is unfortunate, but it's really nice to have early on, so at least you can go ahead and have that 6-link. Now, another thing I do want to mention about this build, the reason why we're only going through the skill gems and the passive tree tonight is because I wanted to make this build so it's not item dependent. There are no specific uniques you need in order to run this build. Obviously, there are uniques that will enhance this build greatly, but this build should be beginner viable without any specific uniques. It will function absolutely fine. Uniques are just going to blow stats out of the water potentially with this build, if my theories are correct on things. So our first support gem with Cyclone is going to be Onslaught. Onslaught is essentially going to go ahead and give us a chance to have Onslaught granted. We could potentially do that. The thing about farming Hillock for the 6-link 2-hander though as well is we do have an option of some really nice 2-handed weapons throughout the game, and potentially buying them, and they may not be 6-links. There's a few unique items that would suit this build a little better, so it kind of takes some of that RNG out of there. We'll talk about that later on down the road when I actually kind of have time to mess around with some items, but I just think blood aqueducts are easier anyways, and with the monster density in blood aqueducts, you can actually get a little bit of XP there too. And I don't want to farm Hillock. But yeah, anyway, so Onslaught support gives us a chance for Onslaught, which gives us attack speed and movement speed. Now, we could have just went flat attack speed with this, but since we're going to be channeling and moving a bit slower, that movement speed is going to be super useful. That's something else to keep in mind about Cyclone, is you don't really want to start using Cyclone until you have at least some boots with some decent movement speed on them. You can get that relatively early in the game. However, you're not going to be able to use Cyclone immediately. So until you actually get to the point where you can use your Cyclone gem, I would just grab any melee-based physical gem that you get throughout the course of like quest rewards or anything that you potentially loot, just until you can go ahead and upgrade to Cyclone and start using that. With the changes to Cyclone, and since we haven't had a chance to play on PS4 yet, I'm interested to see if Cyclone is a bit more beginning game viable as compared to what it was before, because I think it will be. So yeah, that's the Onslaught support gem. We're looking to essentially help our movement and attack speed. Main is also pretty self-explanatory, 30% more physical damage. This is a 100% physical damage build. We're not going to do any elemental damage with this build whatsoever. So we have a chance to maim on hit. And enemies maimed by this skill will also take another 14% increased physical damage. So that's a pure DPS support gem. Infused channeling. This is a fun one. I actually use this on my Winter Orb build in Synthesis League. So it can't be given to totems. We're not worried about that. We do have a totem, but we're not worried about having infused channeling. Infusion lasts for 6 seconds after we're done channeling. We will gain infusion after channeling a supported skill for 1 second. So, Cyclone is a channeled skill, so otherwise we wouldn't be able to use this skill gem. It will deal 39% more damage, so 39% more damage to Cyclone. While channeling, we're going to take 8% less physical damage from hits, so some physical damage mitigation, which is really nice. We'll also grant 10% more damage to the types matching the supported skills. So essentially, we're going to be, getting more physical melee damage from that as well. We're going to take 8% less damage from hits of types matching the skill gem stack, so more physical damage mitigation. So essentially, just think of the fact that we're gaining more physical damage and taking less physical damage. Brutality, another self-explanatory one. More physical damage, 59% more. We're not going to be able to deal any chaos damage and any elemental damage, which is fine. We're stacking physical damage throughout this entire build, so chaos damage, elemental damage, we don't care about that. We're not applying that to our Cyclone or really anything else. We do have a lightning golem, but that's their strictly for the other benefits. We're not really caring about that lightning damage either. Physical melee damage, another self-explanatory one. 49% more physical damage, and we're going to deal more bleeding damage. Bleeding and impale are going to be two things that we're also going to stack in our passive tree, which are going to give a lot more damage potential to the build in general. So that's Cyclone. Obviously, you know, we're trying to stack some attack speed, movement speed, base physical damage. You know, that's essentially the idea of it. We do actually have a little bit of defense added in with the infused channeling. So even though Cyclone's considered a movement skill, our actual movement skill that we're going to be using is Leap Slam. Leap Slam, we're going to go with the standard cookie cutter build for Leap Slam. Faster attacks, allows us to cast it, you know, faster, and Fortify, which grants us a defensive buff. And there are actually some extra bonuses you can add on to Fortify through the passive tree as well. Fortify is a great defensive skill. It's really common for a lot of builds to have this. This, like I said, this is pretty much your standard cookie cutter Leap Slam gem setup for a lot of builds out there. Next, we're going to have a Blood Rage setup. Blood Rage, as you can see, adds a buff that deals physical damage over time, increases attack speed, and life leech. We're going to be stacking a lot of life leech in this build since we're going to be hitting with Cyclone, which is going to be doing a lot of attacks per second. We're essentially trying to fill up our life as quickly or essentially faster than what we're losing it. So there is some potential for us to actually swap out some of the gems and some of these skills with a increased damage on full life support, but I'm not really comfortable putting those in there until we've actually gone ahead and tested it just to see how often I'm actually sitting at full life. Killing an enemy while the buff is active will refresh the buff duration, and it can grant a frenzy charge. Base duration is 10.8 seconds. Keep in mind all these stats I'm giving you are when the gem's at level 20 also. So obviously when you first begin to level these gems, that those stats aren't going to be quite as high. But we're getting increased attack speed, increased physical damage, leeched his life, which all we're doing is stacking physical damage, so that's going to be super helpful. We're going to take 4% of our maximum life per second as physical damage, but again, we're going to be constantly leeching, and we're going to be triggering Blood Rage. So if we're not attacking, we're not triggering Blood Rage, we're leaving it alone. As soon as we see, you know, those big mobs, we'll trigger Blood Rage, and we'll go in and attack. You'll take 4% of your maximum energy shield per second as physical damage. We're not even going to stack energy shield with this build. We're going to stack pure life, not worried about energy shield whatsoever. It's essentially going to be life and armor. Those are going to be the two base stats that we're looking for. And armor is just pretty much going to come from our gear itself. And 25% chance to gain a frenzy charge on kill. Increased duration, self-explanatory. This is just going to make the skill last a longer period of time. And enhance, this is actually going to go ahead and increase the quality of supported gems. Now this is probably going to be the gem that will potentially take you the longest amount of time to get for this particular skill setup, just because enhance is a drop only gem. You can't buy it from any of the vendors in game, so this is something you may actually have to look in the trade market for. There should be a few for reasonable prices. Enhance is a somewhat rare gem. There's 3 drop only gems, but it's by no means ridiculously valuable. You should be able to find someone who's reasonable enough to sell you an enhanced gem later on, and this is probably the least important of it. While it's nice to have an increased quality on your gems, it's not a huge deal, so if you do have to run this without enhance, I wouldn't stress too much about it. So right here we're going to be looking at a couple of curses. Now, something to keep in mind is the fact that you can only have one curse active at a time. So these are actually you're only going to be able to have one of these active standard at a time. And what that means is, since we have 2 curses added to Blasphemy, because this is turning them into an aura, so that we're cursing enemies that are around us while we're using our Cyclone, it's only going to be able to trigger either Enfeeble or Vulnerability. However, there are unique items within the game that can add to your maximum curse. So we likely will be looking for one of those throughout the game. There's also, and we can actually look it up here, Path of Exile plus curse. So if we actually go into the wiki and scroll all the way down, there is one node in the passive tree that will add as another max curse. So it's Whispers of Doom. I'm not sure if that's actually viable from where our tree actually is. Yeah, it's all the way up here. There's no way we're reaching that node. So if we do want to use 2 curses at once, we would have to actually get an item that would add +1 to curse. And I'm not actually sure. See, these are a list of uniques that can potentially, actually no, these are just curse in general items. But essentially all it means is that if we want to switch the curse, we just have to manually cast the other, which is fine. It's not a huge deal just because of the fact that we are going to have some extra skill slots with this build. But anyways, like I mentioned, Blasphemy turns curse skills into auras at a 35% mana reservation. And the curses that we're going to have equipped to that, so we're going to have Enfeeble, which essentially, this is just a big defensive buff for us. It's going to give 19% reduced accuracy, 25% reduced critical strike, and the minus 30% critical strike multiplier, and also either 30% or 15% less damage based on the monster rarity. So this is going to apply to the enemies around us, essentially just granting us some more defense by cursing our enemies' attacks. Now the other one we're going to have attached here is going to be Vulnerability. And this is essentially going to boost our physical damage. So if we're finding that defensively we just don't really need Enfeeble, we'll focus on Vulnerability. So that way we can get that extra physical damage. We have an extra chance to maim. We have increased physical damage to damage over time, so that would actually apply to like bleed. And we're also getting an extra 20% chance to have our enemies bleed when we hit them with attacks. Just as many times as we're hitting with Cyclone, that should be relatively useful. The other thing we're going to throw on there is an Enlighten Gem, and essentially with the Enlighten Gem is one of the other drop-only items. All that this is really doing is lowering the mana reservation that this costs. Not really a huge deal. We can go ahead and just stack some mana on our base items. I'll tell you the stats that we're looking for on our base items here at the end. But we're not really going to worry about mana a whole ton. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for stopping in, Dave. Have a good night. So that kind of covers our curses, which we're turning into auras. You'll want to go ahead and actually manually assign these also, because like I said, we can only have one of the curses in the beginning supported by Blasphemy, unless we do go ahead and get an item with plus curse on it. So you'll want to have these probably in your secondary slot. So if you hold R2, those secondary ones that you can cast, I would probably throw it right in there. So the next is going to be a totem. So we're going to have Ancestral Warchief, which essentially lasts 12 seconds. It's going to deal 122% of our base damage. We are going to gain a boost to melee damage while the totem is active, and a bit of melee range. So essentially it's going to give us more damage and more range with our Cyclone, and it'll also attack some enemies for us. So what I have applied here, chance to bleed, so that way anything our Ancestral Warchief is attacking, it's going to give it a chance to bleed, because as you'll see through our passive tree, we are stacking quite a bit of bleed damage. Faster attacks obviously means more attacks, which means more of a chance to bleed. And then the last one here, so this says Bloodlust, that's not what we're actually going to use. This is just This skill won't be linked to the others here. It doesn't have to be anyways, because it's not going to actually be, it's not going to gain a benefit from any of them, but we're not actually using Bloodlust. What we're actually going to use here is Blood and Sand. So if you look over here to the right, the only reason why I couldn't put this on here is because this is actually the one skill gem that I absolutely love from what I've seen in the new patch notes for 3.7 that isn't listed in Path of Building yet. So Blood and Sand, it allows you to switch between two different stances, which is either going to take away from your area damage and add to your area of effect, or vice versa. So essentially they give us a chance to either widen our area of effect or increase our damage with a slight penalty to the other. There's increased cooldown recovery speed, but we're not too worried about that. It just sounds like a really awesome potential DPS boosting skill gem that I really just want to try out, and I didn't really have anything else that I wanted to add to my totem anyways, so it just kind of made sense to have that there. So our last skill here is going to be our Lightning Golem. Now our Lightning Golem, the lightning attacks can be okay. The biggest reason why we want this is the increased attack speed. Attack speed is one of the skills that we do, or one of the stats that we do want to stack, because it will greatly increase our Cyclone damage. So while this is summoned, we're actually going to have increased attack speed, which is going to in turn give us increased DPS. The rest of these, it's just some elemental resistance, some life, and some damage. I didn't really have any other skill gems I wanted to apply at this point, although we do have room to play around with it and add some different attacks. So potentially what we could do here is even just put this Lightning Golem in this spot here for Blood and Sand, and then have another, 3-link, a different skill with 2 supports and Blood and Sand by itself. Or we could just leave it here and just have another skill with 2 other supports on top of it. So there is some wiggle room, there is some experimentation room with the skill gems, but as you can see, they kind of all synergize. They all have a basic point that we're trying to reach here in the end. So that covers the skills for now, and as I said, this is something that'll likely change as I'm building and as the league progresses, and as I get to try out some of those new skill gems, or as I'm realizing that I'm just not getting the output from specific gems that I'm hoping I will. But that's just kind of the starting point. Obviously, as I actually get to play with all the new changes, this is all going to be subject to change. This is just kind of a starting point. So here we go, that big overwhelming passive tree. It's actually not that bad. So we're playing as a duelist, and we're actually going to be taking the Slayer Ascendancy. The skill nodes we're going to be taking for Slayer they're kind of no-brainers, to be honest with you here. So attack damage and attack speed, I've gone over the importance of that. Obviously attack damage is direct DPS, attack speed is essentially more DPS. We're going to have 10% more damage if we've killed recently. It's going to be super useful for us in mobs. So like high density maps that we're getting into, which is going to be really useful in the Legion League, because we're going to be trying to trigger multiple enemies and then kill them in these instances. So it should actually help with the league content as well. 20% more damage against unique enemies. That's just useful in general for any the unique enemies, the bosses at the end of maps and things such as that. Now, a big one about this skill node: cannot take reflected physical damage. That's huge. One of the big things you'll notice while mapping is that if you're doing elemental damage or physical damage, if you go into a map that has reflected damage for your damage type, you die almost instantly, because the amount of DPS that you have to stack in order to have an efficient build is so high, to the point that if you have that damage reflected back at you, unless you have a build specifically made to avoid reflection damage, which in my opinion is kind of a waste, it's going to kill you. Like, you're outputting so much damage in order to run through maps quickly that your DPS, your life simply can't sustain taking your own DPS reflected back at you. This is also going to make boss fights like at Ziri easier, because you're not going to have to worry about that mirror form. So you can just go in there and whirlwind and not have a care in the world. So that is actually a very awesome passive skill to have. Not taking reflected damage, it makes it so there's an entire map modifier that we don't have to care about anymore. More attack damage, more attack speed, again self-explanatory, and Bane of Legends. So we're going to kill all enemies that have 20% or lower life when they're hit by our skills, so it's going to increase our clear speed. We're going to gain 20% increased attack speed for 20 seconds after we kill a rare unique enemy. Again, more attack speed is more damage. And we're also going to gain 20% increased movement speed for 20 seconds when we kill an enemy at all. Now this is going to be huge for using Cyclone because of the fact that it's going to help us cruise through all this a lot faster. This is going to increase our clear speed by a lot. Now our other skill nodes here are actually going to help our life leeching. So attack damage and leech life, both self-explanatory. Endless Hunger, 20% of overkill damages Leech's life. We can't be stunned while leeching, and we're immune to bleed while leeching. So essentially, because of the way that we have stacked leeching throughout this build to leech on attack, we're not going to bleed when we're attacking something. So that actually leaves us pretty much a spot for a whole nother flask to where we don't have to worry about bleeding. And if we take the Pantheon, where we don't have to worry about poison either, we have a lot of freedom with our items here. So our passive skill tree is freeing up a lot of potential build ideas and just the different items that we can play with in this build, which I think is awesome. And that's the whole point of this build, is to be able to use essentially almost any item that you would potentially want to, as long as you build the correct stats. Moving on, more attack damage and leech life. You'll notice that these two match on each of these, so that makes sense. And then we have this skill right here, 15% increased attack speed while leeching, which we're pretty much always going to be leeching because of the next skill. Life leech effects are not removed at full life, so we're going to continue to have those effects of life leech even after we've fully replenished our life, which is awesome. 50% increased attack damage while leeching, and 6% reduced damage taken while leeching. Slayer is awesome. These skill nodes are super great. I think they work really well with Cyclone and just the leech mechanics that we're working with. That's why I decided to go with this build. Now, along with that, before we get too far into this passive tree here, I should also mention that we are going to have an emphasis on two-handed weapons. I have left, as you can see, 14 skill points open there for you to play around with. Essentially, you're going to have to level all the way up. But there are different slight changes you can make here. I've left the specific weapon that we're using alone, so you'll probably want to grab some nodes for either swords or axes, but I've completely left those off just because that's more or less going to be based off of what you personally find and what is personally good. There are uniques for two-handed axes as well as two-handed swords that are very viable and that will both be super effective for this build. So the way that we're going to start building is actually a bit counter to what you would normally think, because of the fact that we, for the most part, grabbed about every life node that we could find that was useful towards this build while pathing, except for the beginning. The reason for that is we just want some attack speed early on. So we grab a couple of attack speed nodes. Then we come down here and grab some armor, evasion, and life. Evasion's not going to be huge for us. Life obviously is. And armor we're going to get a lot of because armor is directly attached to a lot of your strength items. So we're going to be stacking a lot of armor naturally from the items that we're going to be looting. Move on through here. Some extra physical attack damage, which is super useful. And then we're going to want to hit Master of the Arena. Now, life regen per second, that's actually going to be completely negated, as you'll see later on. Not a big deal, but we're going to get increased melee physical damage, +1 to our attack range, and +20 to strength, which essentially is also going to give us a health bonus. Now we're going to come over here, grab some more life, get bravery, which is going to add to our evasion rating and armor and our life. Grab another life node here, and then grab Art of the Gladiator, which is kind of our reason for building over here. The increased attack speed, increased accuracy rating. We're going to ignore all movement penalties from armor, so that's going to be great. Plus, it's going to give us a +20 to dexterity. Now, there are some nodes that I've grabbed in this build that make up for the intelligence and the dexterity that were required for our gems, so that way we're not having to grab so much through our items. So that way we can actually stack other stats and mods on our items that don't have to be, you know, flat intel or flat dex. So from here, this is where we're going to grab our two-handed nodes, or at least our ones to start with. Increased physical damage, increased damage with ailments, which is for the most part going to apply to our bleed. We'll grab the destroyer node, which is going to give us increased physical damage, increased attack speed, accuracy rating, and more damage from ailments. More two-handed attack speed, two-handed melee damage, more attack damage, and more damage from ailments, which, as I mentioned, it's primarily going to be our bleed. So we're going to grab these nodes to build across here. There's a jewel socket down here. I would wait until a bit later to grab your jewel sockets, so don't grab that early on. You want to grab your stats first. We're going to come down here and grab some life nodes. 10% increased maximum life, some life regen, which isn't a huge, like I said, that's going to get negated. You'll see that later. But we're just essentially looking to stack more life through here. So now we're going to keep building over here to get to Vol Pact. Now this is where you're going to see that our life regen gets negated. So our leech life per second is doubled. Our maximum total recovery per second from leech life is doubled, but our life regeneration has no effect. So all that life regen stuff, it doesn't really matter. However, this is going to increase the efficiency of our life leech, which is, a staple in this build. So from here, life and mana leech, life leech, vitality void, which, more life leech, more maximum recovery per second from life leech, and more total recovery per second from life leech. So essentially we're just making that life leech that much better. From here, this is kind of what I was referring to. We grab this node for 30 intelligence, just so that way we're not having to put so much on our items. If you do get a bunch of intel on your items, you can completely ignore this node. It's something you can respec. I just have it there because I just get the sneaking suspicion, since we're going to require 155 intelligence for our skill gems for this build, that at some point we'll probably need to grab that node. So you probably won't have to grab it early on, but this is something you may want to come back for later. Now from here, with Cyclone being changed into a channeling skill, that's why I grabbed these nodes. Just increased attack damage and speed, and then more attack damage and speed, but we're also getting an opportunity to stack some endurance and frenzy charges here as well. So that should be super useful and make our Cyclone even that much better. So that's essentially as far right as we're going to go, is this channeling node, that bunch of nodes right there. We've already covered over here, so let's continue on to the left here. Up here we have Crimson Dance. Now I'll explain to you why this is good. So our bleeding doesn't deal extra damage to the enemy while they're moving. Now what that means is the way that the bleed mechanic works in Path of Exile is, as you're bleeding, you are gradually taking damage, but if you decide to move, you're going to take even extra bleeding damage. So our enemies are still going to be taking bleed damage, but when they move, they're just not going to take that additional damage for moving. And it's going to take away 50% less damage with our bleeding to start off. However, it's going to give us so we can stack bleeding damage on an enemy up to 8 times. So that's kind of the give and take of this node here. And to get more bleed, we're actually going to go up here 25% more, 30% more, 40% increased attack damage against bleeding enemies, 50% increased damage with bleeding, 5% reduced damage taken from bleeding enemies, and the bleeding that we inflict does damage 10% faster. So that's not only going to get rid of the 50% less damage from bleeding, but we're actually going to gain a bit through these nodes, and we even get a bit of a defensive buff. Like, it's not a whole bunch, but 5% less damage from bleeding enemies, still nice to have. So down here is Impale. Now the way that Impale works is 10%, I believe it's 10% of your damage is kind of held in reserve, and then I believe for the next 5 hits it's kind of stacked. So it's basically putting some damage in reserve to be applied later on to our enemies. So it essentially makes our attacks stronger each time that we hit, and to essentially give them more damage. So that's why we go ahead and we stack this Impale damage and the Impale effect. And we also, get some increased attack speed and increased physical attack damage. So moving on through here, just some more melee area effect and damage nodes, so more damage and increased area of effect. More melee weapon attack range, less area damage taken from hits, 10% increased area of effect if you've stunned an enemy recently, and more increased area of effect. Here's a couple more of the nodes that we're going to take just to kind of lighten the load for the dexterity and intel required for our skill gems. Again, you may not need these right away. You can come back to them. So let's work our way down. Some more strength nodes, which are going to be a majority of what we're grabbing. Two-handed melee damage. Like I said, this is going to be, we're not going to dual wield with this build. We're going to be using two-handed weapons, so we can safely take those. Most of those, it's going to be physical damage, area of effect, and more damage from ailments, so it's stacking onto our bleeding. Executioner, great skill. 24% increased physical damage, 50% increased damage with hits against enemies that are low on life. 8% increased area of effect if we've killed recently, which if we're going through high density maps, that should be relatively often. And 24% increased damage with ailments from attacks. So again, more to our bleeding. Over here we've got some more leech life nodes. So we're just going through and stacking that leech life even more. 15% increased maximum total recovery from leech, 20% increased total recovery per second from leech, and 30% increased damage while we're leeching. So we're even getting a damage buff as well. Now from here, there's two other directions that we break off into. We'll go up and to the right first. So again, another jewel socket. You can ignore that until you actually have a good gem to put, or a good jewel to actually throw into that socket itself. But the main reason why we're coming up here is for this cluster of life nodes. Just a lot of life percentage and a little bit of flat life for us to increase our overall life pool. Now, since we're not really focusing on energy shield at all, we're going to want to stack as much life as physically possible, which is why we've grabbed, I would say, about 90% of the life nodes that we could, going through and grabbing our actual larger nodes here. So from here, if we go over to the right, this is more two-handed melee weapon damage buffs. This one's actually pretty cool because we have a 4% chance to deal double damage. So that's a super nice skill to have as well. Even with that low percentage, it could get us, out of a quick pinch. So life regenerated per second, again, that gets negated, but we do get plus 20 to strength and a 20% increased stun threshold. So added accuracy and reduced mana cost. The biggest reason why we're coming up here, though, it's another 20 to dexterity and intelligence. We're not really too worried about the reduced mana cost because our skills are actually pretty mana spending friendly. So these, you're going to want to grab this node to build up this way. But these two here are similar to what these dexterity and intelligence nodes are for. So if you're finding that your gems aren't leveling to the point where you actually need to grab those for the extra dexterity and intelligence, save those for later. You may not need them. More life, self-explanatory. Come up here, more melee attack speed, more accuracy, more melee physical damage, and more strength, which in turn is also giving us more life. More melee damage, more two-handed melee damage, and the skill butchery, which gives us more physical damage, more attack speed, and more bleed as well as strength. So that's where we stop building to that area from. So now from here, if we're going up through the left, again, more life nodes, life. Can't have enough life. And enemies actually cannot leech life from us with Bloodless, so that is another really cool utility skill that we'll have with this build. So we're going to be leeching, but no one's going to be leeching off of us. Super nice. This is going to add to our Impale effect, which I had described earlier, and also add a bit of strength. Keep building up through here. Obviously more strength nodes, more life and armor. We're not super worried about the armor, although it is, it's going to give us a little bit of physical damage mitigation, so it can be relatively useful. But we're mostly taking this so we can get that extra life. Now, again, another jewel socket. This will be our third one here. make sure you actually have use for that jewel socket before you assign any skill points there. If you don't have a jewel there yet, then you just want to continue building elsewhere. So our last few gems are going to round out with a bit more life and elemental resistances. You know, more life, max. Actually, it's adding to our. This one adds to our maximum fire resistance, so it'll actually max out at 76% instead of 75%. And then it adds an extra 8% of fire resist. We're mainly grabbing this for that extra life. You know, an extra 4% life here and another 3% to all of our elemental resistances. So that's kind of my theory crafted skill tree so far. You know, focusing on impale, bleed, life leech, two-handed weapons, attack speed, physical attack damage, and yeah, that's pretty much, you know, the main focus of this build in general. So the skill nodes kind of came naturally, you know, as well as, you know, the channeling ones over here, which I believe will be relatively useful since we're using Cyclone. There are a few things that you can potentially change. Like I said, depending on if you get a two-handed sword or two-handed axe, there's some other relatively nice nodes that you can get throughout the tree as well. So that's just something to also keep in mind. Now, in regards to items, as I had mentioned, you know, I don't have any items that are actually assigned to this build yet. Mainly because of the fact that you can essentially run this build with all rare items and not need a specific unique, and that's kind of how I try to run my builds. And you know, as the season goes on and I do loot unique items and I have more time to experiment, this will be an ongoing thing. This is just kind of where I'm at theory crafting at the moment, and I just wanted to share this with everyone so you can kind of see how I'm going to be starting 3.7 and where I'm going to be starting Legion League from. And you know, as I go on, obviously, as I find, you know, certain uniques, I'll make videos and I'll mention it in streams, and it'll be an ongoing progress. And you know, you guys can kind of see that as it builds. But the main thing to keep in mind for the items that you have are going to be the actual stats that are going to be on those items, which is, you know, essentially going to be really similar to what we have here on our skill tree. So, Life is huge. Obviously, even with the nodes that we've grabbed, we're going to be short of our intelligence required and our dexterity required. Dexterity by a little bit, intelligence by a somewhat more significant amount. So you will want to have a little bit of intelligence and dexterity on your items. The nice thing is you can mastercraft those onto your rare items. So that shouldn't be a hard threshold to hit. And if you actually get some nice rolls, that's when you can actually, you know, ignore some of these other nodes that we've grabbed or respec them to grab, you know, maybe one of the two-handed nodes, or maybe there's an extra life node that you want to grab, or an extra gem or extra jewel socket. I mean, there are, as you can see, you know, there's a jewel socket down here, there's another one here. You know, there are other jewel sockets that you could potentially build to. I mean, there's another one that's literally right here. This would probably be the best one to go for out of the ones that I don't have highlighted right now, because melee damage is still going to be useful, and you can get another jewel socket with just, you know, 3 points right there. So another thing to keep in mind, you know, and there's another one up here that's only 4 away. So if you do find more really good jewels that are, you know, going to be beneficial towards your build, you know, there are other ones that you can branch off for and grab those as well. And the tree is relatively crazy, but you know, much like in the actual game itself, you know, there is this search function, and in path of building it's super nice because you have those giant red circles. So like we can type in specific parameters and actually have it tell us exactly where those nodes are. So it kind of gives us an idea of what we want to grab, and that's what actually makes this you know, happen in a reasonable amount of time for me. Otherwise, if you were literally poking through sorry about that, excuse me, and like looking at every single node, dude, you'd be, by the time the league finished, you'd finally have your theory crafted build done. So yeah, that search bar super useful. It's also on PlayStation when you're actually in the skill tree itself. If you hit L3 and left on the D-pad together, you can type in the same thing. And if you use quotations, you can actually search for specific terms. Well, I know you can on PlayStation. Path of Building may work a bit differently. But yeah, the mods and the affixes that you'll want on your items themselves, they're going to be really similar to what you've grabbed here in the tree. Health is going to be the biggest one. You're always going to want to stack health. To the same regard, if you can stack a bit of strength, that's also going to benefit your health pool. That's kind of a secondary one, though. It's not as important. Health, attack speed, physical attack damage. You don't want to have any sort of elemental or chaos damage on your items, because Whirlwind isn't going to do any elemental or chaos damage with this particular build. So those are both nodes that are both stats that you can completely ignore. Additional armor can potentially be good just because of the fact that most of the items that we're going to be grabbing are going to be strength based. Some, you may want to get away from strength-based just because strength-based is going to give you a higher opportunity to roll reds. So like for this item here, since we have so many curses, inevitably you may want to grab something that's more intelligence-based, which will give you a bit of energy shield, which, I mean, it's not terrible to get energy shield with this build. We're just not stacking it. And this one as well. Obviously, that's all blue. So, energy shield, it is a little bit of extra defense. However, it's not something we're going to concern ourselves with. Movement speed is a huge one. One of the first things you're going to want to get in the game is going to be a pair of boots with as much movement speed as you can possibly get. The maximum roll you can get for those, I believe, is 30%. So if you can get somewhere between 20 to 25% movement speed, at that point, like, you're ready to run your Cyclone once you have that gem. As I mentioned before, previously Cyclone wasn't really early game viable, but I think with the changes that GGG has made to Cyclone, I think it's something you're going to be able to run much earlier than you previously could. So it's really just a matter of matching up your weapon and I guess you'd call it armor, your actual items with the nodes that you've gone ahead and grabbed here on the skill tree. So there's no specific uniques that you absolutely need. Just make sure that you're stacking your life, you're stacking your physical damage, you're stacking your attack speed, you're stacking your armor, you're stacking, it can be attack area of effect. Basically anything that we've grabbed a node for here is going to be useful. You're also going to need some intel and some dexterity. Just kind of spread that out accordingly. But the biggest ones are going to be your physical damage, your life, your armor, things of that nature. Also your resistances. We didn't really grab a lot of resistance nodes in this tree here, so resistances are going to be huge. So grab as many resistance items as you can. The one thing I always preach is, and anyone who's experienced with the game will preach this, always have at least 75% resists on all three elements. Chaos resistance is secondary, but you want to have that 75% for fire, cold, and lightning damage. You absolutely need it. Don't neglect that. Otherwise, no matter how much life leech you have, how much health you have, how much armor you have, it doesn't matter. Those enemies will eat you alive with elemental damage. So make sure those are capped at 75. That's probably going to be a really good majority of what some of the affixes on your gear ends up being, just because we didn't grab much of that in the skill tree. There just weren't enough of those towards the nodes that we need to grab for our DPS on the skill tree to make sense for us to grab those. A good majority of our skill tree was adding to our life and our DPS, so get your resist through your items as well. But that essentially covers kind of what I've theory crafted so far. Obviously, I'll be uploading this to YouTube, so if you're watching this at YouTube, feel free to shout out in the comments section if you have any questions about anything that I've done. I'm still theory crafting, so if there's something that you're seeing that you're like, hey, why aren't you doing this? Or, maybe it would be cool to try this. I'm open to ideas, feedback. This is kind of the very start of this for me. I just wanted to get a head start on the new league and, just start doing a bit of theory crafting so that way I have a direction that I'm going into before the league starts. I appreciate that, Jay. Thank you. So, you know, I would highly recommend you download Path of Building if you have access to any type of computer whatsoever. Like I said, it's not super intensive, so it's not going to demand a lot out of a computer. You can download it on pretty much anything. Play around. Honestly, most of like the big time streamers that are on Twitch and YouTube and a lot of the PC content creators, they probably spend more time in this app than they do playing the game half the time. And that's because if you go in with a solid build, you're not going to have to sit there and think about those things as you're playing. Like, I already have a really good idea of exactly what I'm doing with my skill gems, exactly what I'm doing with my skill tree, and the way that this build is set up, I can just let the items kind of flow as I'm playing. And, I know the base stats that I need to get on my items, and, I know exactly what is essentially fodder when I first see it. Like, oh, this isn't useful. I can vendor that, or I can just leave that behind. So, kind of take this, feel free to play this build if you would like. Otherwise, feel free to take bits and pieces and ideas from it, or, just kind of take my message of how to start creating your own builds to heart and, start experimenting on your own. Don't be afraid to fail with a build. It's not a huge deal. I've learned from failing with builds. Between that and just kind of seeing what other people are doing and taking bits and pieces of different builds that I kind of like and trying to mesh and Frankenstein them together, which doesn't always work either. But it's fun, and you should be. This giant tree shouldn't be intimidated by it. You should be having fun with it. There's so much stuff you can do with this skill tree, and when you have that first build that you've made on your own and it works, it's so gratifying. It feels so good to know that, it makes you feel like you've mastered the game. So I would highly recommend going in and trying this for yourself. I think it's a ton of fun, and I think as you get comfortable with Path of Building, you'll have a lot of fun with it also. My PSN is actually the exact same as my Twitch. It's just the BullShifter. But yeah, I'll probably end the stream there. I just wanted to kind of give you guys an idea of where I'm starting at 3.7, give you guys the build that I'm starting with, and kind of explain why I'm doing what I'm doing with each one of the nodes, and each one of my skill gems. Like I said, this is all subject to change. This is all ideas and theories so far that I have about how things are going to work in 3.7 with the huge melee overhaul and the new skill gems, the new items, and just everything that's going to be in the game. This is all potentially going to change, but I feel really good about at least the skill tree, and I think a couple gems may get swapped out here and there, but I have a pretty positive feeling going forward that I'll be running this build pretty much intact throughout a majority of the league. So, again, everyone who watched live on Twitch, thank you guys so much for joining me. I appreciate everyone still coming in to watch and participate, even though I was a couple hours late to stream tonight because I wanted to specifically stream Path of Building tonight. Just because it's not something I've done before, and I'm not sure anyone on PS4 has actually done it. So I kind of wanted to bring this to the PS4 community and just, show everyone on there that, these tools that the PC players use, this is absolutely stuff that you can utilize too. It doesn't require a gaming PC. And you can be just as advanced and just as meticulous as those PC guys as you go down the road. Obviously, we had just started on PlayStation. We just finished our first league. But, our knowledge as players in Path of Exile is only going to grow. And you're only going to get more confident. And, I know I'm one of very few content creators on PS4 right now. But there'll be more. There's going to be more people who gain more and more knowledge about the game, and this is only going to grow from here. And with all the rumors of PS5 being backwards compatible with PS4, this should absolutely be a game that's also going to be on PS5 that, you know, we'll all potentially be playing for years and years and years and years. You know, it's built to be played infinitely. You know, that's the goal of the developers. They're a small team. They have no plans of making sequels or different games. Like, this is their focus. And I think that shows through, especially once we start playing 3.7 and we see all of those ridiculous improvements to the melee, you know, system and characters and skills, and just how everything has completely been tweaked and fixed. I'm really looking forward to it. We're going to be able to play that, I believe, in just a few days here. So super excited, super hyped. Gonna stop rambling. Thank you guys again for viewing. Until next time, may the RNG be with you always.